Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to our Twilight session, Clay Blocks, Speedy Building with Low Carbon Materials. My name's Lucy Pedler. I'm co-director of the Green Register along with Charlotte, who's here tonight. I have two other colleagues here. I've got Elaine, who is our registration person. She's the person you've been dealing with pre-event and also will be post-event. And also have my colleague here, Seb. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping. I think you're all very used to this by now. You've all got your presentations on your screens on mute, which is great. You're very welcome to leave the video on if you like. If you don't want to, that's equally fine. This session is about clay blocks. We've got two speakers tonight, and we will be sending you the presentations of both Jenny and Dan at the end of the session. In order to be able to do that, we need to know that you're here. So if you've got a very creative name on the screen like DR9, we might not know you're here, in which case we can't send you the presentations. So if you're not clear about how you name yourself, go down to participants at the bottom of the screen, find your name, click on more, and there'll be an opportunity to rename. Then we know you're here, and then we can send the information to you. The other thing we send you is a transcript of the chat. And again, I think you're probably all very familiar with this, but just in case there's somebody here who hasn't used this before, there's a little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen that says chat. This is the way that we manage Q&A. So Jenny will start first, then we'll field some questions to her from the chat. So put anything else, anything you like in there that's related to the topic, of course, and I'll field that to Jenny. Then Dan will talk and I'll do the same again. And what happens in our Green Register events is that we start to get a really rich seam of information in this chat. People will put in links to other websites or information related to the topic. So we will send you that transcript at the end of the session too. So we'll send you the presentations, we'll send you the transcript. We'll also send you a feedback form. It takes just a couple of minutes to fill in. We'd be very grateful if you could fill that in for us. Some of you may have seen at the beginning of this session, there's a couple of events that we picked out. So if you're a Green Register member, you already get discounts on events. If you're not yet a member, please contact us because the discounts are pretty significant. We've got some really very interesting topics coming up. Retrofitting traditional buildings. We've got the third in our series of real life retrofit case studies. So this is the builder actually talking about the building. Sometimes we have the architect, sometimes we have the client. Sessions on ventilation. We've got a really good one on biodiversity net gain coming up. So do please have a look at our website. Because we've only got an hour, I'm going to get started now by introducing Jenny Harborne of IMAGO Architects. So both Jenny and Dan are going to be talking about how they've used these clay blocks, and they're using case studies to illustrate the pros and cons of this clay block. If you guys, any of you have had any experience of using them, please share your knowledge in the chat. But I'm going to hand over to Jenny now. So Jenny, if you'd like to share your screen, please.
I'm going to talk about monolithic construction with clay blocks, sort of assuming people haven't really come across them. So sorry if you've really experienced, but you'll be able to, you know, lecture us back afterwards. Yeah, they're called large clay blocks or cellular clay blocks because they've got lots of air holes in them. There we go. So this is a real introduction.
Lisa and Peter have a dream, to build a house of their own. Because they are environmentally conscious and also want a healthy lifestyle, there's only one building material they would consider using. A natural one made of clay. Clay building materials consist of clay and water. That makes them particularly natural and healthy. This natural building material absorbs moisture when the air in the room is damp and releases it when the air is dry. Bricks can breathe and don't release any harmful substances into the indoor air. This creates a healthy indoor climate. In winter, houses made of clay building materials stay warm and cozy. They provide optimal heat insulation and protection against the weather and heat loss. In summer, houses made of clay remain cool because they effectively store heat and regulate the temperature naturally, even without an air conditioning system. A house made of clay bricks, blocks, and tiles is safe. It's strong and stable and provides protection from severe weather as well as from fire. After all, clay building materials have already been fired once, and that makes them incombustible. Clay building materials also provide optimal acoustic protection so Lisa and Peter can sleep peacefully. They're already planning to start a family. That is an especially good reason why Lisa and Peter have a clear goal. Their new home should be as natural as possible, made of clay building materials.
Okay, so I first came across clay blocks in an EcoBuild exhibition, I think, in about 2006. They were being imported from Europe by this company who sell and still do plaster, lime plaster and render, which you use with the clay blocks. And I was impressed by them because of the different types of sort of associated products, like the lintel and the clay beams and the different layers of, you could, add a layer or have a corner block, all from the same material. Seem very simple. They don't, by the way, they don't import them anymore, but they do still sell the lime materials. So I was impressed that they're quite a dry construction, which I will explain. The warm, that you get a breathing construction with them, and it's very strong, although it looks like quite a brittle, fragile material. And there's no cavities. You can build it with in monolithic form with no cavity, so none of the fuss and bother with cavity trays and so on. Integrated components I've mentioned, and they've been used throughout Europe for a long time. Not quite sure when they started using them, but they've just only been gradually percolating through to Britain for the last decade or so, really. They cost more initially, a block, if you compared to concrete blocks, but that overall build turns out to be less expensive, which we'll explain. I think the first ones we bought, we specified were thermoplan, but there's quite a few on the market now. They look similar, but they all have slightly different lambda values. So it's worth definitely checking carefully and selecting the right one for the U value you want to achieve. At the time, we were using them initially for extensions to existing buildings. So we were using the 300 block, which achieves a 0.28 just in one skin, with a render externally and a plaster internally, and that's it. You got it. Now Porotherm by E.H. Smith, for example, with a 365 block can go to 0.2, which is great, but any more than that, which you might want for passive house standards, would need insulation in addition. So yeah, the U values, they're quick and dry. And they use actually about 1/10 of the amount of water you would use for a traditional brick or block wall with mortar, because you use a type of adhesive which is rolled on. The joints are very thin. And that means you don't have to wait sort of not, drying time on site before you do the next thing. And also less shrinkage over the 6-month snagging period, for example. So I'm really having to go back and do snag cracks in plaster and joints and things, because it hasn't moved when it's dried out. The actual blocks are about the 1/5 of the embedded carbon of an ordinary fired brick. So that's really quite impressive, because you don't have to They don't have to be fired at such a high temperature. They mix 30% of the product is a recycled wood-based material in with the clay to fire it. And it's a really circular product. If there's any waste, or if you were to demolish a clay block wall or something, it's just ground down and then just add water and start again, fire it up. So it's amazing. You can get a completely versatile appearance from an architect's point of view. You know, you can cover it with whatever you like, render, cladding, you know, timber cladding, whatever, even brick slips if you really want to. And you can get a construction that's breathing with the lime-based materials, or you know, if you've got MVHR, you can use sand cement render, or you know, more standard plaster materials. And if you use it without insulation on the inside, certainly, you know, it will work as a thermal mass for room heating and so on. So it's got a lot of benefits. Can you still see me? Because my screen just...
Yeah, it's fine, Jenny, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, the question, how do you put them together? So I got hold of a Bible of from Detail, Building with Large Clay Blocks, which has got, you know, about a dozen examples in there and lots of really good details, construction details. And I'll show you a couple. So that's a typical at DPC level detail. You can actually use them below DPC, but generally, if you do, you have to tank them from the outside and protect the tanking. So generally speaking, builders will use engineering bricks below DPC level and then take off from there with your block walls. And here is a detail through a window with one of the proprietary lintel blocks. So this will be like a clay block, but you'll have a series of them going across the opening, and we just fill them with concrete and put some rebars in and fill them with concrete, and it's just so simple. They're just part of the wall. And some you will need, probably, depending on, they have different forms of these. Sometimes there's a cellular part to them, but if not, you'll probably need to put some insulation in there to keep the continuity. So there are some cautions about them. They're not as strong as brick or concrete blocks in compression terms. So if there's a retaining wall, for example, you might need an engineer to give you some input. But you can, if there are a lot of window openings, you can actually continue those lintel blocks beyond, you know, join them up together, so you almost get a perimeter beam, really simply. I've mentioned about below DPC. Yeah, one of the big snags is that they are currently all imported here. That the take up just is not considerable, and apparently, and clay block suppliers are actually selling them with details of how to use them in cavity walls, which seems a bit tragic to me. But apparently it's because there's no NHBC certification for monolithic construction yet. So the big house builders and developers won't use them, and so mortgage companies will, you know, it's all sort of linked in with people being able to buy them and having the warranties required. So until that changes, the uptake's not probably going to be enough for them to actually make them in this country. And also that means that some of the more fancy type blocks are really hard to source here. This is another detail. It's just showing them being used actually to form a basement. So again, in this instance, an engineer would have checked that that's going to be strong enough depending on the forces over here. And you'd have to have proper protective tanking externally to achieve that, but they're fine. This is a really good product, which I wish we could get here easily. It's equivalent to the pot and beam floor, but just with clay blocks. So these are all really lightweight blocks that you just pop together between a beam made of the lintel blocks with some reinforcement steels and concrete to form the beams. And then you'd have a really lightweight, solid, warm floor. This is the first project that we use them on, so you just wouldn't expect a conservation area, South Kensington, but behind this facade is an eco refurbishment extension. That's a loft with a timber frame construction. So sort of with some green, there's a green roof there and one at the back, and there's a raised party wall, which for the garden extension, for which we use the bio bricks, clay blocks for here. So in London, most planners will want you to build your party walls in London stock to match the context, but then the neighbour will paint it white because they don't want brick at low level because it's dark. So we managed to persuade them to let us build it in block and render it. And this is, so that's the block wall. We've managed also to externally render the outrigger here, so you can't tell one from other. And that's from the inside. Actually, in this instance, we did line the block with insulation, which has allowed us to have embedded lights and conceal the glass framing quite easily, but that's not ideal in terms of thermal mass. This is another project. So all the brown elements are in clay block. It's sort of 2-story, and that the stair goes up 2 stories. It's a ground and lower ground floor extension in Greenwich. This is where we really wanted to use the clay block and beam construction, but couldn't get hold of it. But we've used the clay blocks. You can use them for the internal partitions, little retaining walls. And this one we have, that's under construction. So these are the lintel blocks, which we carried right through because to give it extra strength, because it was also the edge of a terrace. And that's it finished. So got a nice coloured through body coloured render, larch cladding, bit of mirror, all covering the clay block. This is another small extension in North Kensington. Again, a raised party wall. Went up very quickly. And then the client who wanted to give the impression of it being a brick wall, despite after all that effort. Anyway, so that's it from me at the moment.
Jenny, thank you very much. We've got lots of really interesting questions, actually. Can I pose some of them to you now?
Okay.
Let's see. Oliver asks, are there any examples of leaving the blocks unfinished on the inside face?
No, Well, you have to seal the blocks, really. I think it's standard to, there's a, what's it called? Not monocouche. Dan will remember. There's a I can't hear him. Can I?
Well, Dan knows and unmutes himself.
Sorry, I've unmuted. What did you ask, Jenny?
What's ecopage? Yeah, sorry, I've remembered. The coating on the inside of the blocks.
Oh, like a plage coat. You mean a hard render coat?
Yeah.
The blocks aren't very even on the inside, so they would, you know, you saw it a bit in Jenny's photo. They would look pretty shonky. You know, it'd be hard to make them look very deliberate. Any cuts or anything, you know, they look.
Yeah, they chip a bit.
Of course, the render is your air tightness layer, so
exactly. Yeah.
The wind would blow straight through them, basically. You know.
Mm.
Thanks very much. Love the word shonky, Dan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anna says, what's the thermal conductivity of the blocks, i.e. lambda value? I think you mentioned that at the beginning, hadn't you?
Yeah, it depends on the size. You can get a lot of different sizes. Oh, that's not going to go back to the beginning quickly. Sorry.
I think you'd said that it depended on the manufacturer and the thickness, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can get blocks from like 90 mil up to 460, even maybe more. I don't know. So yeah, you'd have to look at the tables, but you can get with very simple construction, you can get 0.2.
Lovely, thank you. I think you've kind of addressed this, but I'll pose it to you anyway. Noel says, would you use same or similar blocks for internal partitions?
Yeah, you can use the same, so they can bond in nicely. Yeah.
Damien has two questions. How do they perform in locations of severe exposure, and are they approved by LABC, Local Authority Building Control?
Yes, that never had a problem with building control. And I think they're fine in strong winds. I mean, I suppose you might need, if it's really strong, you might need an engineer to have a look at it.
We've just been looking at this for a project, actually, in high extreme weather, you know, extreme exposure areas, really need to batten off and have a protective, you know, rain screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that simply because the render isn't sufficiently?
Well, it's because you're relying entirely on the render, obviously, with any monolithic construction. So
it's not going to blow over, but you might get, you might get penetration.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dermot has two questions. Hello, Dermot. Nice to see you. Dermot says, is there an alternative to NHBC warranty available? And which RSLs, registered social landlords, are using this solution for passive house?
Oh, which ones? I don't know. I do know that I saw a talk by somebody who's doing them in Devon, I think, Housing Association Developments. I think they're flats.
Yeah, Exeter City Living, Exeter City Council is doing it. And the other question was, what
you know, the
warranty providers. Yeah. When my brain operates again, I'll tell you which one it is.
Dan, no worries. Don't need to put you on the spot. Thank you. CSK Architects. Sorry, guys, I'm going to have to use the B word. With Brexit and general procurement difficulties at the moment, with lots of building products, have clay block supply chains been hard hit with a small market here?
No. I mean,
okay, well, next question.
It's just shipping, you know, like everything, you know, that was the problem we had. But
on one project I had, the builders who were Polish just went to Poland with their van and filled it up and came back.
Oh my goodness. That's great.
I think they saved a few pennies in the process, which motivated them, you know.
Joshua asks, if you're adding insulation, what would you use and which side is preferable, as an external or external, internal?
Well, external is preferable. I guess the selection is going to depend on what you want to achieve and the thicknesses, isn't it, really?
Wood fibre?
Would be great, yeah.
Dan, have you used wood fibre?
Obvious choice, I think. I haven't used it in this context, but you know, it's, you know, you're doing an EWI system on a wall. You know, I think there's good arguments for it. In some ways, it takes away from the, you know, the elegance of the single block construction.
Yeah, yeah.
I think there are some advantages too. You know, the rendering would be easier onto wood fibre than it would be onto the clay block. So I think you'd claw back a little bit in kind of costs there, and you reduce your thickness of wall slightly as well.
Joshua asks, what do the builders think, and are there supply issues? Well, Dan's partly answered that already. Vladimir says there's a project in Spain or similar where the blocks are left externally exposed. So Vladimir, if you can find that and you'd like to post this in the chat, we'd love to
Probably
see
a bit
that.
drier in Spain.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, CSK Architects, I don't know what your name is, but I'm just going to have to read you out as that. Okay, where's it gone? Are the big blocks light enough and easy to manhandle from a health and safety point of view?
Yes, they're very light. Yeah.
They're not very light, but they're
all right.
Yeah, I mean, they're fine basically. I think.
Right. I've not tried lifting them, but I've seen the builders.
You know, if you're in a good position, then you know.
I just wondered if the builders complaining because they were so big. Some of them are so, you know, 465 or 300. If it was easy, if you had to sort of, you know, if there were complaints on site with working with such a big sort of block, that was all.
Yeah, it's very. I think it's equivalent to a sort of concrete block, you know, in terms of weight. So yeah, they feel bulkier, but you know, it's not. They're a bit awkward, but yeah, the thing about them, most of the courses, you know, with the zero mortar joint, basically, you don't have to place them as delicately as if you were placing if you're trying to get a concrete block onto a normal mortar joint. So most of the time you'll, you know, just placing them in place, you know.
Have you had to send your contractors onto a course to learn how to do it, or they've just picked it up? Sorry, I should have.
No, that's fine. I've used. I've probably had about 3 different builders, or no, more than that, half a dozen different builders, and from scratch, they've just been quite happy. It's a day's course, or they look at YouTube, you know.
Okay.
Thanks. Have to find the right bits, you know. Sorry, Dan's going to be much more specific. Well, but you're using them, so it's different. But I haven't. Yeah, it's not a problem.
Okay,
but I think the brick. I understand that the general bricklayers are rather upset about it because they feel like they're being de-skilled. So,
wow,
a bit of an issue. Yeah.
Okay, there are some questions, some of which are just comments, which you'll all get at the end. Noel says ideal fixings to use. I don't know if there's something you're going to be covering, Dan, in your presentation.
I forgot to specifically, but back when MBT imported them, they had a particular fissure fixing that was tested, and it basically means you can put a fixing anywhere, you know, which is really nice. You know, you're not trying to hit a batten or something behind a timber frame. But
they are specific, aren't they? For the clay?
But well, yeah. I mean, we found that most the kind of the inner and outer kind of face of the block is sort of a good 10 mil of fairly solid clay, and so, you know, if you're hanging something fairly normal weight off that, normal raw plugs will pick that up quite well. If you're going to hang, you know, heavy shelves or something, then yeah, I mean, it's a frame fixing basically, like a 180 or 100 mil frame fixing, and you can put pretty much anything you want on it, you know. So I think it's a nice thing, although you have to get the right fixing. That also means you can put anything anywhere. So
Great. Thank you. And Adam, I hope that's answered your question about fixings too. So keep them coming, everybody. You've posed some really fantastic questions so far. I'm going to pass over to Dan Wakefield from Greenacre Building now, who's going to give the builder's perspective on using clay blocks.
Okay, so I need to share my screen, right? Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Oh yeah, there we go. Oh, not at the beginning, look at that. All right, here we go. Okay, so I just give you a bit of context. I run a building company, but we also offer design service. So in this context, we designed this project and with the building contractors, and I think I've also put in a historic property kind of specialism as well as a passive house. It's kind of relevant in this context because the skill set needed is, there's a lot of wet trades basically with when you're doing these blocks, and so I think that's an important factor when you're thinking about the team that you've got, which I think is a theme in this, is this sort of the whole construction is slightly different to what you would normally get with a block, normal cavity wall block. So this case study is my house. I'm just going to quickly give you, it's on a hill, so it's quite difficult to kind of see what we're doing a lot of the time. So I try to give you, there's a basically it's a semi-detached house here, and when we bought this house, there was planning permission for an extension. I won't go into why, but we decided to knock the whole house down, not the neighbour's house, obviously, and rebuild it as one house. Mainly, it's the nice thing was that we could build it all out of the same materials, so we didn't have to mix and match. This is what it's like now. I don't know if that makes sense. So that we've got, this is the original house here, and this is the extension, if you like. Okay, so as I said, we started by taking this house down. That's enough of that. So I just thought I'd just give you a few ideas of why we went for it in this particular. I've used it in Bristol a few times when I had a building company in Bristol, but this is the first time we'd used it on a new build project. And I think overall, a bit like Jenny said, that the beauty really of this system is the simplicity. You've got the blocks in the middle, render on the outside, render on the inside, and you're ordering one material for the wall. It's lovely. So also, as opposed to timber, you can put it up in a rain. Well, you can put timber up in a rain, but it's never going to rot, you see, so you don't have to worry about that. And then, as also Jenny's pointed out, there's no plastics. It's at the end of its life cycle, it's just made out of earth, basically. So it's it feels quite a nice thing to use in terms of the long-term, we're not creating lots of plastics that can have to be separated out when it's fixed. Talked about the fixings, and one of the things I really like about it, particularly for if you're trying to achieve high air tightness, tightness, is that unlike if you've battened off your air tightness layer, you've got your air tightness layer, which is your internal plaster, is always visible. And so if you've got a crack develops or something, or if you drill a hole in it and then you later want to block it up, you can always see that and repair it. So it's sort of onwardly maintainable. So there are, whilst it's kind of lovely in concept, there are a lot of differences subtle differences in its construction to the way you would normally build out blocks. Partly it's the size that we're not used to, but the main thing is the bit of sort of stop-start nature, because I don't think, actually, I kind of haven't talked about it, because there's no horizontal mortar joint, which I'll show you in a minute. the system works by having, you get the first course absolutely right on a normal 10mm mortar joint, and then after that you kind of use like a mortar glue, if you like, to place them on. The first course is really tricky, and if you've got a long, you know, if you're trying to get if you've got a long length, it's got to be really, really carefully done. And I'll show you how we try to achieve that in a minute. And because of this, normal bricklayers, you know, it's quite different. It's you spend ages getting one course right, and then you do the next 9 courses, you know, really quickly. So it's just a little bit different. You've got to approach it differently, and that's basically what I put at the bottom there. So we use 2 different types of block, but it's for the same system. Like Jenny talked about the U blocks, we've got a U block here, which is for the lintels. And this is actually a slither of a wall block. The thickness is across the difference here, so it's deeper than it is wide, which is kind of unusual. And you can see the fins here, it slightly interlocks, but there's no vertical mortar joint. So this is the, you know, the nice thing. In some ways, you put your order in and you get, you know, you get a truck basically, or 2 or 3, and this was our first truck of 2, straight from Germany. So that, you know, this is kind of nice. You think, well, this is everything for the walls that we in one go. But then also you have to manage a huge quantity. I staggered my two trucks so that we could didn't have to manage quite so many in one go on a small site. So we put as many as we could on the slab, and you can see here we've got a couple of pallets of U blocks, and the rest are all just wall blocks. And then before we got them, we'd set up here ready for our first course, which is the one that takes the time. Here's a picture of Gary scratching his head. It's it's difficult to describe how well this course needs to be done, and I think that like is the biggest sticking point. For all these blocks are extruded and then planed completely flat, and the aim really in this course is to get them so that you could roll a, you know, like a snooker ball along them, and you couldn't, there's no differential in the heights, and that means that the next course you can put on, and they go on perfectly on a perfectly smooth surface. And it's kind of difficult to get your head around the fact that it needs to be as good as it does. So there's a little bit of, I was the only person on the team that had used them before, so there's always a little bit of getting used to this. After that, we've got this, you can just see the machine here. We've got this roller machine, and we can roll out this muck, which glues the next course on, and it's quite phenomenal how well bonded everything becomes. So this is the only picture I could find of the machine, actually. So you splodge it in the top, roll it along, and then you can place one after the other, stack of the joints, and you can do, you know, a course on a, you know, if it's straight run, no windows, you can do courses literally as fast as you can place them on, you know, stacking them. So I just put this picture in here to show that although it seems, you know, it's nice to point out how simple everything is, you know, you've got all this logistical issue, and the problem becomes when you're going to cut the blocks. So here's a picture of our footprint, and you know, this is a problem with the cutting, is that we had 2 people doing this amount of wall and 2 people doing like this amount of wall, and we were keeping pace pretty much. So if the amount of detail that you have significantly impacts the amount of, as with you know, any bit of wall. But I think particularly here, we've got this machine here, which I showed you a minute ago, but I didn't point out, this bandsaw machine. And without the bandsaw, this system would be on this scale would be you know, I don't think it'd be viable really. So that's a really important thing to note. This is just an interesting note. We've used the U blocks on their end here, and so this is how versatile you can be with them structurally. We're creating a concrete column to take the end of a steel, and then I'll show you now. Okay, so when you get up to your top of all your lintel courses for your windows, it's obviously much better if you can get all your heights all the same. You've got to create a framework for all of them, you know, shuttering out for what we're starting to see here, which is these U blocks being laid on top of the blocks and across all the openings. And I'll just show this here. This is right across the front of this building. Jenny touched on this. We form a concrete lintel right the way across here. So we've got a really strong wall here. And this will get poured with concrete in a moment. But you can see that before we did that, because obviously the concrete is less insulating, we've filled the outer part with here we use cork, and then it's rebarred. But it's, you know, this is really nice. We might manage to mitre the U blocks on the corners and create this really strong ring beam around the bay. So it's really, you know, it's really nice to be able, you know, it feels nice to, out of these two blocks components, you know, we can make pretty much any shape. And so here we've got you can see across the front, the concrete lintel, and we're beginning to fill in the other concrete lintels. But you can imagine how, compared to the previous 9 courses, everything's slowed right down again. And there's a lot of work that goes into these courses. We're also obviously starting to think about joist hangers for the next course as well. And like on the front, at the bottom of this course, where we laid our blocks onto a bed of mortar, at the midpoint, you also do another leveling course onto a 10mm sand cement mortar joint. So, you know, this course, again, everything feels much slower, and you can see this OSB shutter basically here. What we've done is we've screwed on a layer of OSB just to give us a guide, so that we get this absolutely straight with a lot more ease. And that's actually really helped. That really helps us actually. Here we are starting to get the structure in. The blocks in vertical compression are 7 kilonewtons, so it can take a decent amount. And we've got a combination here of some of the beams are bearing straight into the wall. Most of the joists are on hangers, which you can see here. I'll show you a photo in a sec. We're taping these for air tightness later. So what we did is we knocked up a little jig with and used a wood router, routed a little pouch into the top of this course, and sat all our masonry hangers into that little slot. And then we could do our next course over the top without them interfering with that course, and that worked really nicely. The thing to watch obviously is this air tightness junction, and whether this is the air tightness behind that, because you can't ever access that again. So we put the joists in, deck out, and then you can build the next course pretty much off this this floor. At this point, we probably should have scaffolding around. It didn't arrive. So, but the nice thing is that you can build this all from the inside. And here you can see now we've left this wall open at the end so that we can keep bringing blocks onto this level with the telehandler. And you know, it's all about managing the materials. You know, you've got this huge volume of material that you're trying to move around all the time. And this is, coursing doesn't always work exactly. So ideally you'd dimension everything to this, to the dimensions of the block, but you know, sometimes it's not possible, and you can end up with these awkward sizes that we end up cutting real thin slithers. So, and what we found was, even if you had designed it to be the right size, sometimes it just didn't quite work, and we ended up having to put infill slithers in various different places, which was, you know, annoying. So now we've got our second, you can't really see because I haven't got high enough, but we've got a second U channel, and of course above all the next blocks, the window openings, and our roof structure is starting to go on, and actually we've already started to render, which is you know, making good progress of the weather. This was just before the winter, so we were trying to, so that's, I had some extra thoughts, but I don't know what the time is. What's the time? Maybe I should leave.
It's we've got 10 minutes left, Dan. There are some questions. Are there any slides you'd like to share?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I had a few. I don't know if no, forgot to add the pictures. I was going to talk about render and you know, the main thing that I guess that I think is worth talking about, which is although you think of them as, you know, you can see that they're variously wet from rain at different points, whilst the blocks obviously themselves don't get wet. Sorry, don't mind if they get wet, you know, that massively affects how well the render set. So one of the things we struggled with this when doing it slightly later than we would have been ideal is that it took quite a long time for the blocks to dry out, and then that affected our plaster. And the knock-on effect of that is that the plaster's taken much longer, which has meant we've not been able to tape to the plaster. So we've been waiting to be able to air tightness the junctions between, like, you know, the roof, the ceiling, and the walls, and you know, where we've got walls abutting, the internal walls abutting the external walls, we've had to leave gaps everywhere to try and to allow the plaster to dry before we could tape to them. So, you know, that's been something that's been difficult to, you know, been a bit of a wrestle, really. It's just that getting the sequencing of that stuff has become frustrating, I suppose. But, you know, luckily, you know, it would be a problem if you're under a tight schedule, I guess is my point. It's hard to predict when you'll be able to tape to it or apply your next coats, particularly in the winter. So that's, you know, I guess that's probably a good time to finish, I think.
Okay, Dan, thank you. Well, there's lots of questions that for both you and Jenny. Jenny's been hard at work behind the scenes trying to respond to some of them. Thank you, Jenny. So I'm going to start where we left off and see how far we get. So Terry says, do they course with brickwork?
No. No.
Okay.
So, you know, you're into you'll be into you know, a wall tie, basically.
Anything you want to add to that, Jenny?
I'm not sure why you'd want to course it with brickwork. Oh, to maybe existing. No, you'd have to do a separate joint.
Yeah.
It would move differently. Yeah.
CSK says, can the clay and lime be returned to the earth if you bond each block with the adhesive? Doesn't this mean they're not designed for disassembly? I think this was the comment, Dan, you said about returning to the earth at the beginning.
Can you just repeat that, Jenny? Sorry, Lucy.
Yeah. Can the clay and lime be returned to the earth if you bond each block with adhesive?
It's not really an adhesive. I mean, I kind of use that term because it's
Thin.
it's that's kind of it's like a grout basically, but it's a cementitious grout. So it's probably the least natural element of the system, but yeah, feels close. It feels pretty close. You know, it's.
I mean, I think the thing is, compared to conventional construction, it's a lot more biodegradable than a lot of materials. Thank you. Mary says, if your air tightness is your internal plaster, how do you deal with integrated services?
They're all chased out. So, you know, where necessary, we chase out with, you know, a grinder or a router, and then we plaster behind, you know, plaster the channel, you know, before you then put your surfaces in. It's, you know, it's moderately time consuming, you know, to make sure you get a really good, you know, that air tightness layer is continuous behind your surfaces, and then you plaster it all in.
Okay, I think some of Harry's question has been answered, but there's a reference to kind of point loading, or you know, strategic points where perhaps a lintel or a structural load rests onto them. Is there anything you have to think about in terms of beefing up that part of the wall?
Well, the easy way that we've done a few different things. Like I said, we did form a column in one point, but I think where there's a particular point load, the easiest way is to put in a couple of U blocks and form a little concrete lintel where you get where that loading is going to be, and then you know, it distributes it much more widely. It's quite that, you know, so the blocks that where you saw the joists sitting in the wall, that's what we've sat them onto. Generally, it's onto it if there's not a lintel there already.
Okay. You were very clear about getting that first course really right, and Terry said he's used laser to level the first course. Have you ever employed that method? Well,
what we did was we lasered a former around with the OSB, went on with the laser basically, and then you know, it meant you've got something solid to place the block onto. So worked really nicely, you know, took out 2 degrees of freedom when you're laying laying that block.
Thanks. Brian, I think it might be better if you unmuted yourself. I'm not clear what your question is, if you don't mind. It's about air tightness.
It wasn't a question so much, but being a practicing architect and having architect friends in Germany and Austria, whom I've been visiting for longer than I care to mention, this is absolutely standard across Europe.
Yeah.
And mostly they get their air tightness with render, probably a line-based render, internally and externally. And if you're trying to approach passive house, they will simply use 15, 16, 17, 18 centimeters of insulation externally, and use a thin render on top of that. And it makes it very easy because you don't have the tremendous fiddle with differential cavity wall construction that we have over here, where your cement block is going one way and your clay brick is going another.
Right.
The point is very well made. The reason why I never used it in general practice was because it was just so difficult on the smaller projects that we were using in East London and Essex. But you can use bricks as an external cladding, and in fact they do on the continent, but it has to be thought through extremely carefully at the design stage. And it was an observation really, and like Jenny, I think that if this were to become a mainstream part of the UK industry, the concrete block folks would struggle.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that, Brian. John, comments or questions? I'm not quite sure at what point you said this, John, so I'll pose it and then you might have to unmute yourself. It does make sense. Is that true at the underside of the window head too? The corks seem to be on the outside edge of the wall.
Sorry, that was to me. Can you say it again?
Is that true at the underside of the window head too? The corks seem to be on the outside edge of the wall. It's not saying what it's referring to. John, are you still there?
Yeah. So it was a carry on from the question about insulating the concrete beam. So the cork seemed to be on the outside of the wall, which is great. But then I didn't know whether there was anything underneath that.
Well, normally,
above the
yeah.
window.
So yeah, I see what you're saying. So generally, the window or the door is outside the concrete lintel zone, if you like. So it's you're, you know, at that point that you're, you know, obviously your wall is much thinner, so that's where you're not getting as much thermal bridge through, because your cork is in line with where the window sits in the wall. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, John. So there was a comment from Joe, in an effort to avoid excess concrete, and we all know there's a huge amount of embodied energy in concrete due to the cement. We're considering using glulam for lintels instead of the proprietary lintels. The manufacturers are happy with this, but on a buildability perspective, does Dan have any concerns about this method? And actually, Jenny then commented that she'd be concerned to combine timber in case it stays damp. So, you know, that is a risk.
I think it'd be interesting. I mean, you obviously want to try and avoid having air cavities in those U blocks. I guess but I don't know how if you're using U blocks, and I guess, oh, maybe you don't need to. So it never occurred to me to do that, because generally building control don't like you holding up masonry with wood.
Yeah.
So that if you could get around that, which you know, I don't know, I wouldn't like to know if you could or not. I guess you could not use the U blocks, and you could put the timber, you could put a timber lintel in straight in, and then you could line that with fiberboard or something. So, and then the next course would sit on the wood, but obviously you are kind of mixing masonry and you know, obviously, yeah, it would be interesting. Yeah, it's just making sure those materials combine well.
Yeah, and as Jenny said, you know, timber's fine if it stays dry, so you'd have to make sure you detailed that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could look, I think probably looking at trying to optimize the thickness of that lintel would be
Yeah,
the first.
you don't use a lot of concrete. I
Say
mean,
again?
it's it obviously is a shame to have to use a bit of concrete, but it's not a lot, because the clay block is most of the, well,
Yeah,
a lot of the volume. Yeah,
I don't think we used, I think we used maybe 1.5 cubes in all the lintels or something.
yeah.
So, you know, given the overall wall area.
Thank you for that. It's partly also because we're looking to use arched openings in some instances, and that sort of rules out the proprietary system.
Well, you could do that in U blocks. I mean,
Well, I was going to say, yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, put some formwork up and get them cut to shape.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it would be difficult, but
They might even have curved blocks in Europe.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you. That's actually been really helpful.
If you formed it all like, I don't know if you saw, it wasn't very obvious, I can show you. If you formed it like a column, you know, so it was a tube, yeah, with your other walls made up to the top, you know, you could just have a hole in the top with all your, you know, you need to have rebar already in, and then you could potentially, it's, you know, it'd be interesting, be fun to make.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan and Jenny. So we're up, with the time's up, but I can't resist posing this last question to Dan from Joshua. Yeah. If you were building your home again, which would you choose, clay blocks and timber stick build? I'm building my own home soon and currently consider both.
Well, you know, I think, I mean, basically as a construction company, we have a timber frame system we use, probably, you know, fairly standard, or the clay blocks. And you know, I think partly it depends on what team you've got and what experience you know, who you've got available. And I think, and then partly it depends on this kind of way up. I feel like there's this kind of balance between having a timber frame system that on the face of it's made out of wood, but actually has loads of tapes, loads of composite materials, you know, longer term, you know, the deconstruction of that is quite complicated. What elements of that can be reused? You know, there's this whole kind of, you know, fairly complex long-term sort of trade-off with timber. Whereas it's easier maybe initially to say, okay, the embodied energy of that might be smaller. Or you've got this clay block system, which, you know, probably has a higher embodied energy, but it's got less sort of blends of materials. I think I would do the same again, but I think it's site specific and team specific as well. You know, I think one thing that I meant to put in, which I forgot, was these 365 blocks are kind of a really natural, nice size to use. That, you know, they're not too thick. I think we've got like a 0.18 U value. So we've managed to get to Passive House with this, but we're in Devon and we're also semi-detached. I think if you were to go outside the southwest, you know, you would really struggle. With any other form factor, you'd really struggle to get to Passive House. Certainly if you didn't want to use an insulated block, which you can get, which we haven't talked about, you would be looking to externally insulate the blocks or use a thicker block. And that slightly changes the equation, or, you know, as to the kind of simplicity of it. But I think I'm not going to give you a definitive answer, actually. But
there isn't one, is there?
I don't think there is one.
It just shows you how complicated this is. And actually, thank you for mentioning Passive House, because Laura had asked something about that. So I'm going to sum up, guys. Dan, would you like to stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we all thank Jenny and Dan? You can either unmute yourself and thank you, or you could put your reactions and put a little whatever you like. But thank you very much for sharing your experience. It's fantastic to hear from people who've really committed to this type of construction, have used it, are very honest about all the pros and cons. We've got lots of great information in the transcript, which we're going to send to everybody. Vladimir, thank you for putting some of your links in there. You'll all get those. If you can bear to, please put the feedback forms together. It doesn't take long. Dan and Jenny would love to hear, I'm sure, as we would. We've got so many events coming up, so we hope to see you again. And from there, I just wish you a good evening. Thank you very much.